Hey everybody, Wayne here. In today's overview review, I'm taking a look at Franklin, November 29th through 30th, 1864, published by Old School Wargames, a brother company to Worthington Publishing. This review copy was provided to me. Franklin, 1864, is a two-player hex and counter war game simulating Hood's disastrous campaign into Tennessee during the American Civil War. This game uses the Civil War Brigade battle series to allow you to fight the historic battles of Spring Hill and Franklin, Tennessee in 1864. There are separate scenarios for each battle, or you can fight both of them in a campaign scenario. Your primary goals will be to keep your casualties down, while likely either trying to capture supply wagons if you are the Confederate player, or moving those supplies out of harm's way if you're the Union. Let's do a quick overview. I have a complete playthrough of the Battle of Franklin for an in-depth look at the game. I'll cover my pros and cons, and as always, we'll end my final thoughts. Alright, let's get on the table. Alright, let's do our quick overview here. So, you have the map. It is a mounted map board. And, as I mentioned, there are actually both battles of Spring Hill and Franklin printed on the double-sided map board, which is really nice. My playthrough, I covered Franklin, so that's kind of what we'll look at here. It is a standard hex encounter game, right? You are going to have the terrain as expected. Historically, seemingly accurate from what I understand. I'm not an expert on the battle, though, so if someone knows more, sees any discrepancies, please let us know in the comments below. Otherwise, you have the actual town of Franklin here. You have the fortifications that were set up outside of Franklin. The Union will be set up within here primarily. You have the rebels entering. You can see there's an A and a B here at these hex points, trying to either flank the forces of Franklin or, as they did historically, primarily assault directly. The map here will have a turn track on it. Both sides do, and it gives you a number of turns. It also gives you the hours. On this hex encounter map, like most hex encounter games, you're going to be placing your units. Now, the Union in this particular Battle of Franklin is going to be set up entirely on the map already, versus the rebels are going to be entirely reinforced or come in as reinforcements from off map, entering into those two locations. Being a hex encounter game follows a fairly standard set of rules, I would say, when it comes to things like combat, what's on units, things like that. So different types of units. First of all, are going to have different movement points, and with artillery, you can see here we have some horse artillery. It's going to be whether they are limbered or unlimbered, right? So ready to be moved around or ready to fire. Infantry can either be just regular movement, line formation, which is the regular just like this, or they can be in column formation to increase their movement. You would place an in-column marker on them. Cavalry will move around as is, or they can be dismounted to engage in fire combat. Otherwise, if they're mounted, they're not going to be able to engage in fire combat, but they're going to have a greater movement. The counters themselves, you're going to have the brigade commander's name at the very top. So for Ross, Cantley, here it just has horse artillery. And then you're going to have the division commander or commander above them underneath. So Walther Stewart, Jackson Forrest, Chalmer Forrest. You're going to have to rely on those when it comes to the command phase, which we'll describe the sequence of play here in a second. Each of the units, besides sort of the names of, their subordinate units, the names of their leaders are, you have the strength points in the bottom right. They're within a colored box. The strength points, pretty standard, right? Higher the strength points, the more strength points they have when they're rolling on the CRT. Also, that means the more men they have available to lose as you take hits, as you lose strength points as a result of combat. The second big thing is the color of the box. The color of the box, and there is gold, black, and then there are green. I have them around here somewhere. Green, here's one. And here we can look at a Union unit, by the way. So these are rebel units. This is a Union unit. The colored boxes are going to be morale. Green is going to be the weakest morale. Black is going to be in the middle. Gold will be the strongest morale a unit can have. When combat happens, there's often going to be morale checks after the end of it, depending on the result. If there is a morale check, you're going to be rolling against that number. So not the number that's in that box, but again, those are the SPs, those are the strength points, but the number that color box is worth. Again, 5 for green, 7 for black, 9 for gold. higher the better, right? Because you're trying to roll that number or less. If you have a leader stacked with you, it's going to give you an additional +1, maybe some other modifiers, just depending on kind of the game board and what's going on. If you fail, that unit is going to panic, and it's going to rout, and it's going to have forced retreat, maybe retreating through other units, which may then also have to roll morale checks and see if they rout. So create a little bit of a chain reaction just depending on where they're retreating from. The units, the strength points, as you can see, because we have, this one has up to 17, right? How do you keep track of them as they suffer losses? Very simple. There are going to be strength point markers. They'll be placed under it. So Lane's brigade here, he suffers 1 SP loss. You place the 16 up, put that underneath on the board, and you'll keep track of it that way. And it is an I go, you go type of game. It's going to be, depending on the battle, one side or the other goes first. The Battle of Franklin, it's Confederates the first turn, or first half of the turn, right? And then the Union goes. Battle of Spring Hill is the opposite. Running through sequence of play real quick, command phase. There are going to be leaders. There'll be different types of leaders. There's going to be, there's not going to be brigade leaders because each brigade is its own counter. But there's going to be division leaders and there's going to be corps leaders, right? So you have something like Chalmer, or you have Forrest here, right, who is subordinate to Hood for the rebels. Different types of leaders. You're going to want to have your units within either 4 hexes for the regular leader or 3 hexes of replacement leader to make sure they're in command. So in this command phase, you're just checking everyone's command status. If they're out of command, they're too far away from their leaders, you go ahead and place an out of command marker on them. Just shows that they're not able to move into zone of control of enemy units. They can still conduct offensive or defensive fire combat. Then you go to, the rules say you go to the organization phase. That would be generally where you're building breastworks. However, this game does not feature them, so really you skip the organization phase throughout this game. Then there's the offensive artillery phase. So this is where you decide your artillery. Are they going to be moving, or are you going to be firing with them? Now remember, they do have to be unlimbered, right? So they have to be on this side. If they're still on their limbered side, you're going to have to wait for during the movement phase to unlimber them and get them ready to fire. But if they're available to fire and you don't want to move them later in the movement phase, you can go ahead and fire with them. Once you're completed, you're going to go ahead and mark them with a fired marker. And I'll cover how combat works in a second. It's very simple. After that, you go into the movement phase, and this is where hex encounter style, right? You are moving your units from hex to hex. Units have a certain movement points, depending on if they're infantry, dismounted cavalry, limbered artillery, mounted cavalry, leaders, or supply wagons. So many movement points, each hex in its terrain. You get bonuses for traveling along roads or pikes. You get the idea. After the movement phase, you're going to go into the combat phase. Oh, and by the way, remember movement. I do want to mention quick, zones of control. Units traditionally have zones of control, maybe influenced, or maybe they don't cross the Big Harpeth River, for instance. But a lot of the times you have to worry about zones of control. Units can enter a zone of control of an enemy. They can't move within that same unit zone of control, and then to move out, it costs an extra movement point. All fairly standard hex encounter style rules. Now you get into the combat phase. The second player goes first, right? So say you're in a turn where it's the rebels going first, Union would go second. The Union, actually gets to fire defensive fire first. So anywhere on the map that they have their units available to conduct fire combat, they can go ahead and do defensive fire. After that's completed, first player, the one who was the active player, right? They get to conduct their offensive fire. Fire combat, very simple. You're going to look at those strength points that you have on your units. You are going to, and remember, regular artillery, which it seems to have a ton of these artillery around, cavalry. All right, so basically you're just adding up. You can combine fire from hex to hex, right? As long as everyone's in range. For infantry, the fire range is, and dismounted cavalry, who act as infantry when they're dismounted, it's going to be 1 hex. For artillery, they can fire up to 5 hexes away. And then their strength points will be modified by the range. For infantry, it's just 1 hex, and it's times 1. But any units that are firing, you can go ahead and just add up those strength points. There may be modifiers on the die roll, but when it comes to the strength points, generally speaking, they're going to be straight unmodified, unless you are artillery. Artillery that is 1 hex away will be times 2, stronger when they're point blank range. If they're farther away and they're firing at infantry, it's going to be reduced by half. If they're farther away firing at other artillery, it's just going to be their base strength points. All right, you add up the strength points. You're going to go ahead and consult a combat results table. Check for whatever column. You're then going to roll a d10. The combat is d10 based. Roll a d10. So say you were checking and you have these two units firing on a rebel unit, 15 and 11, total of 26. Check the 25 through 28 column. You go ahead and roll your d10, and you're going to see what happens. Now, say you get, we're doing the, 25 through 28, I said, and you rolled a 7. You go check that column, you check down to 7, there's a number 2. The 2 means that unit you're firing at is going to take 2 strength point losses, 2 step losses. So if it happened to be a rebel unit that had 7 strength points, reduced to 5, you're going to go ahead and grab the old strength point marker, mark it at 5, down from 7, and place it like that on the map. You're then going to conduct a morale check. Also, on the CRT, if you just see an M, that means a morale check as well. If you see a number with the letter R, that means they're taking the strength point losses and they're suffering a retreat. Regardless, though, if there's anything listed from the M, a number, or a number and R, you're going to then conduct a morale check. This is where we talked about the color of the box surrounding the strength points. Again, whether it's green, not so good, black, okay, or gold, great morale. You're going to roll a 1d10, you're going to compare to that. So you are the Confederates, you have, there's a black morale, which is a 7 morale number. You roll a 1d10. If it's just your guy, you want that number or less. If it's just him alone, we rolled a 5, so he passes his morale check, so he's not going to panic and flee. Now, with this black morale, if he had rolled an 8 or higher, he would have panicked. So you would then place a panic marker on the hex where he was at. That +1 indicates that your units, if they are fired upon, have to make morale checks, or actually have the +1 on the roll, which remember is bad because you want to roll low. And then you're going to put a routed marker on him, and he's going to have to retreat 3 hexes away. Now, if he has to retreat through your guys, other units of yours, you're going to have to make morale checks for them. Leaders can modify the number to help you out, right? Obviously, a positive there. After the combat phase, you've had, defensive fire, you've had offensive fire, you go to the melee phase. So this would be where you can have one unit. They can't combine during melee. It's going to be one unit, basically a defending unit, to pick a hex. It can be melee attacked by one adjacent attacking unit. That defending unit gets to conduct defensive fire. So maybe may have already done it, so they get to do it again. If you're conducting melee, then you go ahead and conduct a melee using the same CRT and same results, right? Causing morale checks, SP losses, possible retreat, possible rout, and panic. After that, you go to the rally phase. This is where you would flip any breastwork markers. Again, those are not in this game. Remove fired artillery markers, remove panic markers, and then you can attempt to rally routed units. So those units that have that routed marker on them, you just make a morale check. If they pass, you can go ahead and remove that. Because while they're panicked and while they're routed, they're not going to be able to move towards the enemy anymore. They're going to have to move away. And so you're going to need that to get them morale improved to get them back in the fight. Combat, already covered that, basically. Very simple, adding up strength points, rolling on a CRT, giving the results. You're going to see a lot of retreats, a lot of panic, a lot of routes. You saw that in my playthrough. That is a big part of this game. So units can have 20 plus strength points. You may never end up, eliminating all those strength points, but odds are you're going to get them, if you keep being attacked, and get them to retreat or rout and flee at least once. The last thing I want to touch on is victory points. You keep track of casualties. So there are casualty markers here for both sides, right? You can keep track of the number of casualties, adding up for victory points. You also often have things like the wagons here. So, for instance, in the Battle of Franklin, the Union has wagons that are in Franklin. These are supply wagons historically. They had, fled Spring Hill. Now they're up in Franklin. They're trying to head back towards Nashville. The bridges here are out, though. Once those are repaired after the 1700 turn 5, you can then move them out. Move them to here. You can see it is marked as kind of a VP hex. And you get to go ahead and leave the map there and gain victory points for the Union. So causing casualties, trying to reduce your casualties, and then any special things such as a victory point location, or in this game, this particular game, you have these supply wagons that the Union is worried about getting away free, and the rebels are worried about trying to capture and destroy. Okay, I think that's it for a good little overview. Again, for an in-depth look at the game, or more in-depth, go ahead and check out my actual playthrough. Otherwise, let's go on to my pros and cons. Cons first. Alright, my first con with this game, and the system in general, is it does get fiddly. Now, you're only managing one combat unit in a hex, thankfully. But that one combat unit can have a leader stacked with it. It could have a dismounted or routed marker on it. It could have an SP marker under it. And as that unit takes damage in combat, that SP, strength point marker, will need to be constantly rotated to show the current strength points. So for just sort of a quick and dirty example, here you have Biffle's cavalry division here. Say we have dismounted him, so now he acts as infantry. And he also happens to have Chalmer, the division leader, with him, right? So he's stacked on top. You have the dismounted marker. You have the actual brigade marker, and then you have some SP. So if he's taking damage, right? So you started off with 7. He's taking damage. He's down to 5, let's say. Now you have that. Now every time he takes damage, you got to work through your stack, get to the bottom, reduce this, flip it over. Okay, it's down to 4. It's down to 3. If it gets down halfway, you actually flip over the main counter. See how you get a little crazy? Now I'm holding him up, right? I'm not on the board, but still. Now if you have, in addition to this, when you have big battles, so again, if you look back at my playthrough video, I had a huge, huge melee, huge battle around Franklin, a lot of units all adjacent to each other, so it's going to be that much harder for you to get down there to pick them up and to manipulate the counters in general, but especially the strength point markers underneath. It's not the most fiddly system I have ever played, but when you do have those large-scale battles like I mentioned, the map can definitely start to feel a little crowded. And if you do have larger, thicker fingers like I do, constantly picking up the counters, rotating the strength point markers, or placing new ones, it can just get a little tedious. I'm not sure there's a real solution that I can recommend, just something to be aware of, that you will be manipulating the counters and markers quite a bit. The second con is pretty small, but I do wish the panic markers indicated which side they belong to. So I had mentioned during my overview that, you cause a panic and a rout, that you place down a panic marker, which then will influence that side when they make morale checks nearby. If they're adjacent or on this hex, they're going to have a +1, which a +1's bad, right? Because you want to roll low. Well, you have to just remember whose side that belongs to. And you can get, when you have big battles, you can get multiple panic markers on the map. And so, you have to try to remember, hey, is this for this side? Is this for the rebels? Is this for the Union? In the heat of battle, it would be nice to just see at a glance which side, right? If this was gray or this was blue, which side does that panic marker actually affect? Instead of having to try and remember who was previously in that hex. Now, it's usually easy enough to figure out. It's one side, it's I go, you go. So they do get removed during the rally phase at the end. So they don't stay out there, the entire turn. But it's also just one more thing to try and remember and keep track of. If the panic markers were blue and gray, it wouldn't be an issue at all. Okay, that's it for the cons. On to the pros. First off, if you can't tell, this game is just a gorgeous production, right? The counters, they're large, they're thick, they're pre-cut, pre-rounded. The artwork on the counters is pleasant to look at, even if it doesn't really wow you, right? You're not going to look at it and say, oh, I've never seen such a beautiful counter. But that said, I think that it looks very nice. They're very clean, very easy to read. You can see who the subordinate unit is. You can see the leaders. Numbers are clear. The colors for the morale are very easy to see, right? Having that black, green, and gold just stands right out, and I really enjoy looking at these counters. The map board itself, it's mounted, it's well done, and while the artwork, like the counters, is a little more standard than exciting, even more important, though, the terrain is clear and easy to read up close and at a distance. The large counters and the large hexes on the map, right? So you can see the counters fit in the hexes pretty well. Keep everything easy to manage, which is especially appreciated considering how often you manipulate the counters, right? When you manipulate all the strength point counters. So if the hexes were any smaller, it would be a problem. As it is, it works just fine. Second, I do love that the game itself comes with the 2 separate battle scenarios. And the mini campaign scenario, we can play both battles in a row. You aren't just getting one map and one battle in this box, right? So the playbook, you have the historical Spring Hill scenario, historical Franklin, and then you have the Spring Hill and Franklin combining them. So even though it may seem like, well, only 3 scenarios, no, trust me, you're getting 2 separate maps, a scenario for each one, and you're getting a combined game where you can kind of keep track of the losses in between. You can have a completely different second battle, right? If your Spring Hill goes differently than it did historically, then your Franklin battle is going to be much different as well. Third, I just like the combat system. Units can be worn down over time, but often, as I mentioned, what is more important is not just their overall strength points, but their morale. Lower morale brigades are much more likely to panic and be routed, which can cause other units they're retreating through to rout as well. Your well-planned assault can quickly fall apart, not just because of battle casualties, but from men panicking and fleeing. I believe that was a huge part of the American Civil War, and it's nice to see it simulated here so well without much added rules or chrome. All right, that's it for my pros and cons. Let's end with my final thoughts. Franklin 1864 is a great addition to the Civil War Brigade Battle series of games, and is also a good choice for newcomers to the system. The fact you get 2 separate battles and an option to combine them all in one box is a big improvement from games where all you get is one battle by itself. This game comes with, as of now, the latest version 1.4 of the rules, and I'm happy with how the system has continued to evolve over time, such as adding a melee combat mechanic, something that I believe was introduced in the Gettysburg game. I just love how simple the system is to learn and play. There's only 8 pages of rules, a simple command and control system. For a hex and counter game, which hex and counter games can sometimes drag on, right? You're manipulating so many counters, you're playing out every single combat, they can take a long time to play. This one plays surprisingly fast. Yet even with that simplicity and with that speed of play, it still does a good job simulating history. If you watched my Let's Play video, you saw how close my playthrough of the Battle of Franklin came to the historical result, unfortunately for the Rebs. I play games with far more complex rule sets that can't say the same. The game and system, they're not perfect, but my only real complaint being how tedious it can get during large battles to manage stacks of counters and markers and to be constantly adjusting strength points. But because it's a brigade level game, there is a relatively low counter density. It never feels truly overwhelming. I did see a comment from a gamer online about not feeling the rout panic system was appropriate for a brigade level game. I have to question that comment. Franklin isn't the only battle during the American Civil War where multiple regiments, and yes, brigades, were either forced to retreat or simply had so many men panic and flee that the rest either joined them or surrendered. Simply, and in this case, simply look at the 2 Union brigades that were left in the advance line in front of the Confederates at Franklin. They were routed, they panicked, and they were either the newer men, recent recruits were captured, there was hundreds of prisoners, or they fled back to the rest of the Union lines at the entrenchments around Franklin. Now, I have been and I remain a big fan of this system. I love what Old School Wargames / Worthington has done with it, and I hope to see many more battles and campaigns covered in the future. Now, if you want to know more about these battles, and you want a good overview of the entire Tennessee campaign overall, I can easily recommend the Confederacy's Last Hurrah, Spring Hill, Franklin, and Nashville by Wylie Sword. This was a great book that I really enjoyed. It gives you an in-depth look at both sides' command structures, supply situations, and strategic and tactical choices, starting all the way from the Atlanta campaign and continuing through Hood's ultimately disastrous campaign into Tennessee. All right, thank you to everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed this review. Please let me know what you think of my video and this game in the comments below. And until next time, everyone, later.